Oh, I guess we should actually get started. And as a way of introduction, because I know there's some new faces here that I have not seen, let me just say my name is Tad Meyer, and my wife Ann Stevenson and I have been members, participants, clergy at Trinity since around 2009. And during that tenure, we have done, and I have done, and Ann has done, we've led Bible studies and book groups, and I've done a lot of talking. And this is my swan song, because I think that Ann and I have decided that the time has come for us to really retire. I retired for the first time in 2009. Since then, I have retired 6 times.
You're not very good at it.
I know, I have failed completely. Anyway, so in thinking about what I wanted to do for the swan song, I told Nicholas that I would just like to sort of post-hole historically some of my favorite eras, some of the, I think, the most important watersheds in the history of the church, and particularly in the Episcopal Church. So we're going to be looking over the course of 4 Thursday nights. We're going to start tonight just talking about the early church and the Constantinian triumph. But then we're going to take a break, and on March 7th, we're going to reconvene and we're going to talk about the Reformation, the English Reformation. And so we'll spend some time looking at that, but through, I think, a rather unusual lens. We're going to be looking at it to really ask the question, was the Roman Catholicism that Anglican polity replaced, was it really as corrupt as we've been led to believe? Was it really a church that was in dire need of reformation? So that'll be one aspect of what we'll be talking about. And then, excuse me, did I say March 7th? No, that's February 29th is Reformation. And on March 7th, we'll be crossing the Atlantic and looking at the foundation of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America at the time of the Revolutionary War. And some fascinating characters in that saga. And then the final one, which is on March 21st, will focus on the Oxford movement, which took place in England in the 19th century and had an enormous impact on Anglican worship, not only in England, but also in the United States, and on the whole understanding of patterns of liturgy, patterns of clergy, patterns of polity. So we'll finish off with the Oxford movement on March 21st. What are my credentials? Why I'm doing this? I'm a historian by training. I did my PhD in church history at Cambridge University. And actually, one of the reasons I'm starting here, as you'll find out when I go through my particular slant on the Constantinian triumph, has to do with some subjects that are near and dear to my heart, one being the catacombs of Rome. So we'll spend a little time delving into those. So, tonight, the Constantinian triumph, the transformation of the early church. And of course, before we move ahead with the triumph, we need to spend some time to deal with a few concepts of what was the early church, what did it look like, the church of the first 3 centuries. And I just want to start by dismissing a couple of prevalent concepts. One is that the church through the first 3 centuries was constantly under persecution by the Roman Empire. No. There were large periods of time when the church was not persecuted and was really an established form of worship within their communities. And so the church was not, and when persecutions did occur, they usually occurred in a specific region under a specific leader. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry, you were gonna introduce me.
No.
Okay.
And I'll adjust the volume.
He did introduce you in the other room briefly.
Okay. And what can I do with that? And so I think that this notion we have that, shortly after the Pauline period, all the way through the Constantinian triumph, the church was really struggling for its life under these waves of persecution by the Roman Empire is just not true. And we'll talk more about that as far as martyrdom is concerned and things of that sort in a bit. Well, what do we know about the life of the early Christians? Well, you know the Bible, you know the Pauline letters, you know the Acts of the Apostles, and there are, of course, a vast number of other extra-canonical documents which talk to us about some of the beliefs and practices of the early church. But I thought it would be more interesting in some ways to look at some of the physical remains, instead of dealing with the literary trail or the biblical trail, to get an idea of what the early church was like through some of the archaeological evidence that exists. And one of the main ones is a wonderful town that you may or may not have heard of called Dura Europos. Now, Dura Europos is actually, if you follow that red line, it's the one, that big trail coming down, it's the red box, which is just at the bottom there, over to the right. Dura Europos was a city. There you go.
How wonderful.
This isn't my first.
It was founded in the 2nd century as part of the Hellenization of the region. And it was established there on a very important and very active trade route. And it was a very typical city of that era and that location. Now, what happened was very interesting because the city was completely lost from knowledge. Nobody knew about Dura Europos until there was a British expeditionary force, thank you, David, that was sort of out bivouacking shortly after the First World War. And while they were camping, they uncovered some walls that they thought were very interesting. And fortunately, because they had some sensibility, instead of trying to dig around them or mess with them at all, they went to Cairo and they notified the French and the English that these ruins were there. And that set off an archaeological dig, which had some interruptions, but basically went through for the next 30 years or so. And what they uncovered in Dura was that, well, to explain why these archaeological remains were so interesting is that Dura was this thriving city, until 253. And at that time, the Persian king came down and he laid waste to the city. He sieged it, and interestingly enough, that's one of the reasons some of the walls survived, is because the inhabitants built up the walls to try to support them for the siege. But anyway, the siege eventually was successful, and the king of Persia came in and he removed the entire population.
Yeah, where was
So-
this located?
Yeah, I don't read the map.
Yeah, where are we in?
That's Turkey.
That's Turkey.
So Syria's to the right, it's not
Yeah.
on there.
So the
So-
Romans, though, should have been in control of this, shouldn't they have?
Romans were in control of it.
The Persians attacked the Romans in 233.
Persians, at this particular stage, this particular area of the world is up for grabs. Okay? And again, it's on a major trade route. But hang on for 1 second, you'll see what we're talking about. It's not as if these particular cities are important from a political or even a military point of view. And let's just move to the next one here, if I can get it. Okay, I'm sorry, that's a little hard to see. That is the street plan of Dura.
Wow, very Roman.
Yep. But what's really fascinating about it is if you go through those various squares, you're gonna find that there's a temple of Adonias, there's a synagogue, there's a temple of Zeus Kairos, there's another temple of Zeus, there is a temple of Gadi, there is a temple of Adogatus, there is a temple of Zeus Megistos. The best image I always conjure up to try to explain what Dura was like is, you know how you go into every town and there's one street that's filled with fast food places? And you go down and they're all the fast foods? That's Dura from a religious point of view. You've got a religious situation which is filled with multiplicity. It's not, the other image that comes to mind, and I just thought of this, so it may be irresponsible, but is Star Wars. You know, when they go in to one of those cities where there's all sorts of aliens from all sorts of different places that are mixing about and everybody's, well, that's Dura. Dura is a place where tradespeople and people from an incredible variety of cultures, backgrounds, professions, they come to Dura. And they build these places. And there's, of course, an enormous competition between these religious sects. So much so, for example, here you have in Dura a synagogue. And the iconography of that synagogue is absolutely stunning. I'll show you a picture later on, not of the synagogue, but Yale University was very much involved in the excavation of Dura. And they, in those days, of course, this is the 1930s or so, and what that meant was that you basically take everything you possibly can and crate it up and send it home. You know, so like the Elgin marbles and things of that sort. Pack it up, send it home, show it to the people. So anyway, so much of the synagogue, a lot of the Christian house church, which we can get to, was dismantled, taken back, and sent to New Haven. The synagogue has one of the most incredible iconographic schemes you'll ever see. It is filled with all sorts of scenes from the Bible, all sorts of depictions of human beings. Does this ring a bell with anybody? Are you supposed to do this? No. No, this is definitely a no-no. And scholars have often wondered why the synagogue would possibly allow for that kind of iconographic scheme in a house of worship in a city like this. I think the only thing that makes sense, and several scholars have, of course, argued this, is competition. All these other temples had large iconographic scenes. They were all places of decided beauty, of aesthetic qualities. And so the synagogue felt that they had to compete. And we'll see what happened to the Christians. So, in Dura is a house church. This is the only house church that we know about. Why? Well, there certainly was during this period, from the 1st to 3rd century, this was how the church generally worshiped. They worshiped in churches, when they weren't really churches, they were houses that were converted to suit the Christian community. But in most cases, what happened is that the house church, the property that the house church was on, was owned by the church. And when we get to the Constantinian triumph, and we get to the proliferation of the building of Christian edifices, they owned the land. So they often destroyed the house church in order to build the basilica of the church. So here you have, the first time, because this thing was put in amber, we have the first house church that we've seen. Now, unfortunately, I can't point. Okay, but what they've done is basically to take a standard Christian, a standard house.
Here we
of
go.
the-
Here comes your pointer.
Okay, so they've taken a standard house with the patio in the center, if we want to call it that, the atrium. And then over to the left, my left, they've knocked out a wall to make a bigger room. Okay, so that's the room that scholars believe was the center for the celebration of the Eucharist, for preaching. That was the primary liturgical space. Okay, just off to, in the back of that, right there, that was a little room that had, and you can just see there's a little white spot in between it. It was a room that was separated from the main room, but it had a little hole in it, so that the people who were sitting in there could what? Hear. Okay? They could hear what was going on, but they couldn't see it, because this is the catechumen. All right? These are the people who are preparing to become Christians, and they're not allowed to take part in the Eucharistic feast yet until they've been baptized. And so what they do is they get to sit there and they get to listen to the service, they get to listen to the sermon, but they can't participate.
Early live streaming.
They were live streaming. Now, if you go along the back,
Pinhole camera.
over there, we'll see more pictures of this, that's the baptistry, which is by far the most fascinating iconographic room in the house church. And we'll look at that in some detail. And again, it's very interesting from a iconographic point of view. There's the baptistry. The Eucharistic hall, no images. All right? No images on the wall at all. No paintings, nothing like that. In the baptistry, there is. How come? Okay, but there's no right answer. I mean, it's all guesswork. But I think one of the most prominent guesses, and the one that makes the most sense to me, is that in the Eucharistic hall, they wanted no images to distract from the central symbolism of the bread and wine. Okay, so that was what they wanted people focused on. They didn't want people looking around, thinking about teaching images and things of that sort. In the baptistry, it was different. There was a salvation story they wanted to tell. Now, in that, you see the red arrow that goes into that arscolium, and then there's a right there's the arscolium, and then there's a plateau. Can you see right back there? And there's a hole in there, and that's where the baptisms took place. Now, it's interesting. The only other place you see that architectural feature is in the catacombs of Rome. And what would happen there, of course, is you'd have the same architectural feature, and you'd have the same ledge with a hole in it, but that's where you'd put a body. Okay? And you'd have other, we'll show you more. But you would put the body in there, and there you were baptizing people in that space. Now, I remember once, sorry, complete digression here, but I was doing a baptism at my old parish in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts, and it just so happened that through some connections I won't bore you with, the retired presiding bishop, Frank Griswold, was doing the baptism, and I was assisting him. And Frank later on wrote his a little memoir, and he included this scene in it. He said, he was talking about something else theological, but he said, I remember once doing a baptism in Massachusetts, and he said, I baptized the baby, and the baby started screaming like mad. And he said, the rector immediately turned to the congregation and said, well, you'd be screaming too if you were being buried with Christ. That's the imagery. You are being buried with Christ, okay? Now, there is an iconographic scheme throughout the baptistry. If you can make out on the left, that's in the Arscolium, that's right above the baptismal font. And that is something which you'll see time and time again. If you look to the left, you see a figure. And what does the figure have on its shoulders?
The lamb.
A lamb. It is the Good Shepherd. And there's other sheep down there. On the right, this is the paralytic being healed by Jesus, picking up his bed and walking. These are, almost all scholars agree, the earliest depictions of Jesus that we have. And there's one other, which I didn't bring a picture of Jesus and Peter walking over water. And there's also other imagery in the baptistry as well.
Ted, what would you take this as?
This is 3rd century.
3rd century?
Is it fresco?
The one on the left is fresco. The other is some kind of painting on the wall, but it's not necessarily fresco. What's interesting about it, and we'll get back to this when we look at the catacombs too, but the first major thesis that I did was on the aesthetic function of early Christian art. And what interested me about these images, and also a number of images in the catacombs, is that they had the ability, as we can see in the synagogue, to do more artistic representations. They could have done these pictures in a different way with a lot more artistic flair. They didn't. And again, you have to ask the question, why? And my argument at that time was that they did not want art. Art's purpose was didactic. It was not aesthetic. You were not supposed to linger over art. You weren't supposed to engage it because that could lead you down the path of idolatry. What you did is you had significant art. Art where you looked at it, Good Shepherd, know it. He's the Good Shepherd. That's what I need. So that a lot of this art, and in the catacombs, in the early paintings in the catacombs, we see that kind of artistic depictions. This I just threw in here. This is a picture of the exhibit at Yale. If you get to New Haven, you certainly should go there. It's stunning. They have a lot of the stuff from. They have the font, the real font, from the Dury Ropus house. They have a lot of pieces from the synagogue as well. Okay, Catacombs of Rome, old map of Rome. I don't know how much you know about the catacombs, but you know they're basically they're very interesting architecturally. The catacombs were cut in a substance called pozzolano. Pozzolano was the substance that was used by the Romans to make cement. So it was very desirable, and it was mined throughout the Roman countryside. The interesting thing about pozzolano is it goes in veins, all right? And what happens is you know, if you cut a tunnel, then what you're gonna have to do is support the tunnel, support the roof. So you're gonna have to put in some kind of superstructure, you know. Think about the mines that you always saw in the westerns that you grew up with, you know? And they've got the wooden beams and things holding up the sides of the tunnel. Pozzolano, you don't have to do that. Because if you follow a vein of pozzolano, the minute the pozzolano is exposed to air, it sets up like cement.
It does what?
It sets up like cement.
Oh, wow.
So you can dig, and as long as you follow the vein, you can dig right along. and keep going, which is what they did. So, for example, on the left, we have a typical hallway in some of the catacombs, and you know they're extensive, but that's called, what's cut in the side are called laculi. And what they are is basically, this is the poor man's grave. But you would cut the shelf into the pozzolana. You would then put the body in it, and then you would seal it, usually with discarded marble that you picked up someplace else, which caused a great deal of confusion, because all along the Via Appia and everything, there were lots of Roman monuments that had left a lot of debris around, so that there were a lot of marble pieces that were designed for somebody else's tomb, and they would just take them and put them and use them again, recycle them, so to speak, to cover up the laculi. Now, this one doesn't show it too well, but what's interesting is if you've been to the catacombs, you can see that sometimes the hallway has not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 6, 7 that go up. And you say, well, how in the world did they get a body up there? Well, they didn't. They put the body in, whenever they got something filled, they dropped the floor.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh.
Easy enough to do. Now, on the right is a little more upscale. This is a cupola, which various families would have a room set out, much like what we have in modern cemeteries. When you walk down and there's a family vault. Well, you had running off, you had family vaults of that sort, and they would be for any number of family members. And you can see there the same Marscolium we saw in Dura. But then they put a body above it. Again, during the history of the catacombs, the paintings do develop some sophistication, but never quite as much as what would be capable in a pagan environment. You can see there on either side, I think I'm going to get this right, on the left is actually Moses striking the rock to bring water in the desert. And on the right is Noah. And then, of course, on the top, we have well, these aren't those, but one of the most prevalent images is the Good Shepherd. These are two images from the catacombs which have created a lot of controversy, and there's no definitive answer to it, but the one on the right is often suggested to be one of the earliest depictions of a Eucharist. And on the left, it is a woman in Oran's position that some suggest is actually a priestly role.
Ted,
Yeah,
may I interrupt you?
Absolutely.
Can you go back to that, of the very rough one, the loculi?
yeah.
Were they Christians that were buried there, or anybody?
In the catacombs, there are Jewish catacombs, and there are Roman catacombs, and there are Christian catacombs.
Okay,
Okay? The Christians predominate.
okay.
Let's debunk a few things. It's funny because when I was in Rome and I was doing research in the catacombs, I decided, since a lot of my work had to do with tourists who went to the catacombs in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, I decided I needed to see the catacombs, even though I had some wonderful letters of reference to scholars, and I did go around with them, but I said, I gotta do this as a tourist. And so I would go on these tours of the catacombs, and inevitably the guide would start talking about the persecuted Christians huddling down there, hiding from the Romans and having their Eucharist, and never happened. Never happened. The Romans knew exactly where the catacombs were. The Christians never hid in them. There are chapels and places of worship in the catacombs, but they are all from the post-Constantinian period. They're all when people began to go to the catacombs to worship in a spot that was holy to them because of the martyrs and saints.
Thank you.
Okay?
Ted, Nero, however, was persecuting the Christians around 60 to 65 AD, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
So is there kind of a switch over when all of a sudden there are more Gentiles becoming Christians and it just becomes more accepted?
No, what happens, and I'm just focusing, yes, Christians were persecuted, Christians were killed, but not nearly to the degree that we've often been led to believe. And the reason we've been led to believe it is because, okay, I'm going to tell you more than you wanted to know. The catacombs were lost from common knowledge back in the 12th and 13th century. They fell from knowledge. And nobody really knew they were there. And then in 1578, a banner here, there are some workmen working out the Via Appia, and they're digging for pozzolan. And one of their spades goes through the roof of one of those passageways. And they discover this underground city of people who had obviously been buried there. Now, 1578, what's going on? Well, you're at the height of the Counter-Reformation. So there is an incredible propaganda war going on between Protestants and Roman Catholics about who is the authentic heir to the Church of the Apostles. And so all of a sudden, Rome says, what do you mean? We win. Here's a trump card. Our city is built on the bodies of the martyrs and the apostles. And so one of the things that they immediately decide is, well, how do you determine whether a grave is that of a martyr or just an ordinary Christian? And they come up with two theories. One is if on the outside of the covering, which no longer exists in those, if there was the sketch of a palm branch, that meant that the person was a martyr. And then they found these vials that were actually attached by cement on the outside. And they said, they looked and they saw a red residue in the vial. And they said, that's blood. And when somebody was martyred, they would take a bit of their blood, put it in that ampulla, and then put it on their grave. Now, if you really want to learn about that, I did publish an article in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History on the vial of blood controversy, which didn't really get resolved until the 19th century. But the point here is that literally thousands of these graves were identified as martyrs because of that signification. And it meant that people thought that practically everybody in the catacombs had been martyred, when in truth, the number is very much smaller. And the palm was simply, again, a sign of victory, and actually, they finally discovered in the late 19th century, when they had the ability to do chemical analysis, that the vials contained perfume. And it was the
To
way
make the place
of,
smell better because it stank.
well, it was like putting flowers on a grave.
Yeah.
Same
No, I
concept.
mean, it's a pretty smelly place.
It could have stunk down there too.
That's-
All those
Yeah.
dead bodies.
Well, great, fade away. Anyway, now we will move ahead a bit. And we will move ahead to the Constantinian triumph. Let me just make sure that I haven't missed anything. Anyway, here, and I know David's gonna really shoot me, but I thought in order to get through this material, I probably should read some to you about the Constantinian triumph, and then we'll just stop and open it up to your questions. Well, of course, before the Constantinian triumph, Diocletian was the emperor from 284 until his abdication in 305. And he carried through a major remodeling of the empire after the fearful crises of the 3rd century, which involved defense, currency, taxation, prices. They had a wage and tax freeze. The economy was a mess. And Diocletian made some rather draconian measures, or took some draconian economic measures to try to control inflation. Well, the empire itself was divided between 2 Augusti, who were each assisted by a Caesar. So there was Diocletian and Caesar Galerius, who ruled the empire east of the Adriatic, while the western half was ruled by Maximinian and his Caesar Constantius, who was the father of Constantine. Now, at a solemn sacrifice attended by Galerius and Diocletian, the augurs were unable to discern the usual signs on the livers of the sacrificed animals. Presumably, some argued, because Christians crossed themselves at the time of the sacrifice. Diocletian went to the oracle of Apollo at Miletus and was told that the Christians were causing false oracles. On February 303, the Christian cathedral at Nicomedia, Galerius' headquarters, was dismantled, and the next day an edict was issued which declared that all churches were to be destroyed. Sacred vessels were to be confiscated. All Bibles and liturgical books surrendered, and all meetings of worship forbidden. A few months later, a second edict, apparently to accommodate all of them, and in the autumn, an amnesty was granted on condition of sacrifice. You had to sacrifice to the gods. In 304, all citizens of the empire were required to sacrifice on the pain of death. But enforcement of the edict, as also, was largely limited to the east. In the east, in the west, some churches were destroyed, but no one was executed. When Constantius died in York, England on 25 July 306, the soldiers proclaimed his son Constantine emperor. Constantine, like his father, worshipped the unconquered sun. But he did have a half-sister named Anastasis, resurrection. In the east, where Christians were more numerous, Diocletian wanted to avoid bloodshed. He retired, however, in 304, and Galerius, a bitter opponent of Christianity, now could exercise his unrestrained fanaticism, a minor bloodbath, and while he was dying in great pain, however, in 311, he issued an edict which granted toleration and permission to assemble to the Christian community, if they would pray for his health and for the defense of the state.
Okay.
His death, however, did not settle the matter. After his father's death, Constantine went to Gaul to gain the support of the ex-emperor Maximian, who had retired there. Constantine married the emperor's daughter and then marched on Maximinian's son, who had succeeded his father. Constantine and Maxentius, at the entrance of Rome, met at the Milvian Bridge. You can see right there on the left. Maxentius' forces were outnumbered by those of Constantine, and in a rash and impulsive move, he left the safety of the city walls of Rome to meet his enemy. And it was an enormous mistake. Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge on October 28, 312, and he became the ruler of the Western Empire. He then met with the leader of the East, Licinius, in Milan, where they divided the empire and promulgated an edict of religious toleration, known as the Edict of Milan in 313, which not only granted the church toleration, but also ordered the restoration of all confiscated property. Now later, Licinius revoked the edict, and Constantine went to war with him, defeating him in a series of battles in 324. And it was at that time that Constantine became the sole ruler.
Ted, could you just explain why one party wanted to destroy the church at that time. What was the threat of the church?
When we're getting there. The church, but as far as the earlier persecutions are concerned, there was a lot of hostility between Christians and other bodies. When I showed you the picture of Duriaropas, remember that is the kind of world you're living in. The church at this time is a mom and pop store, okay? And it exists within an incredible array of other religions and cults, all of whom are vying for control, all of whom are vying for political attention and support. So it's very easy during this period for one particular sect or religious body to fall from favor. And when they do, the other religious bodies are more than willing to take advantage of the situation. Now, Constantine, and we're going to get to that, the big question is, why did Constantine take this startling step of the Edict of Milan and supporting the Christian church? Whoop. Okay. Now, the reason must be that, to some extent, Constantine believed in Christianity. To what extent, it's very difficult to say. He was not formally received into the church until his deathbed in 337, a practice which was not unusual, given their understanding of baptism. You know, baptism was once and for all. When you were baptized, your sins were washed away. Okay? But if you then were baptized and your sins were washed away and you went on sinning sometime, they could be washed away again.
No.
So, you know, it was sort of logical to say, I'm going to wait till the last minute. And perhaps that was Constantine's
And keep
thinking.
sinning along the way.
Yes. Constantine did for years after 312 continue to pay his public honors to the cult of the invincible sun. And he kept that cultic symbol on his coins along with the Chi Rho. The Chi Rho is what we see up there. Now, what is it? Constantine first saw the Chi Rho just before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in a dream. When God presented him with a symbol, and God said, "In hoc signo vinces," which means, of course, in this sign, conquer. The night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he repeatedly had another vision which directed him to place the sign on the shields of all his troops. So he had all of his troops hand their shields over, and they made the Chi Rho. Now, Constantine, however, appears to have learned about his adopted faith gradually under the tutelage of a number of religious advisors, chief of whom was Bishop Hosius of Cordoba. Now, by the time of the Edict of Milan, the church had already begun to move in a political direction. Sometime during the first decade of the 4th century, 300, 302, 309, some 19 bishops met at Granada, Spain, to produce 81 canons or rules for the body politic, the institutional church. In doing so, the bishops were self-consciously patterning themselves after the model of Roman legislative assemblies. Now, a new understanding of institutional authority was emerging, as can be seen from the Canon 17 of that Council of Elvira. That canon specified that if Christians allow their daughter to marry a priest of idols, they shall not be given communion, even at their end. To die without the sacraments was to risk damnation. The church was now using the sacraments as a means of discipline, an instrument of authority to maintain the standard of orthodoxy issued by the episcopacy. Now, following the triumph, this emergent tendency was greatly accelerated. During the course of Constantine's rule, the church made the quantum leap from labor to management. The primary cause of this transformation was the patronage of the emperor. In short, the church was no longer the product of the urban environment, as we saw in Dura Europos, but became the manager and the director of that environment, a change which can most clearly be seen through the lens of architecture. Now, the house church had sat in a row of urban dwellings, indistinguishable from the adjacent buildings, part of the urban landscape. With the bounty of Constantine's treasury, the landscape became dominated by churches, large magisterial structures that spoke the language of affluence, power, and authority. So here, of course, is an apse, and basically this is the church that replaces the house church. Now, it's directly adopted. I mean, basilica, as you all know, simply means the king's hall, and it was a governmental building that existed throughout the Roman Empire, and it was primarily used for political purposes. And what would happen is the apse down there at the bottom would be where the governor or the person in charge of that particular district or area would sit. And he would be flanked by his underlings, by his good servants and folks and administrators. And then people would be in the nave. They would have come in and they would have been walking around, talking, doing whatever. And gradually, when their petition was to be held, they would be brought up to the apse, and they would make their case. And because the emperor's representative could never pronounce judgment or make a decision without an image of the emperor above the seat of the bureaucrat, was a picture of the emperor. Okay? So basically, the church takes it, as you can see on the left, and they simply adopt it. So that the picture of the emperor gets replaced by Pantocrator, by the Christ triumphant, where the administrator sat, there now sits a bishop. The bishop is flanked by priests and deacons all the way around the apse. And people, of course, now are coming up not to receive necessarily judgment, but to receive communion. But it is an astonishing transformation. There's Constantine on the right. He, of course, throughout his reign, built hundreds of basilica. And there on the left, we now see clergy that have been institutionalized. In more practical terms, well, let me just back up. With the bounty of Constantine's treasury, the landscape became dominated by churches, these large magisterial structures that spoke the language of affluence and power and authority. Those buildings began to form the landscape. They were not part of it. The city gave birth to the church, and now the church would give birth to cities, cities of the living and cities of the dead. In more practical terms, the church began to assume a totally different role within Mediterranean culture. The church's new status and wealth means that it becomes an important rung on the ladder of advancement. The church historian Eusebius noted and deplored, and I quote, "the unspeakable hypocrisy of those accepting the church and adopting the facade, the deceitful name of Christian. Christians could qualify better for imperial appointments and could benefit from a number of other monetary and professional opportunities. As one historian summarizes, it was in some manifestly profitable in worldly terms to declare yourself Christian. And Christians believed that the motive was widely at work among at least the governing classes on whose conduct their opinions are occasionally reported. The conversion of the upper classes excited, of course, more conversions. The church was suddenly inundated by the upwardly mobile 4th century yuppies, straight off the advertising pages of the New Yorker. And the church struggled to adjust to these new educational, theological, and aesthetic demands. And if we have time, you can, we don't. But educationally, this is the period when Lent emerges as a rigorous period of training before admission to communion. Theologically, the gospel was translated into the most sophisticated language and concepts of philosophical thought. Aesthetically, the new churches were decorated with the latest and most costly artistic fashions, mosaics, and great murals. Bureaucratically, church officials began to take on civil duties. The state granted financial support to Christian clergy and excused them from secular liturgies and duties. Christian bishops became secular magistrates, and in 318, Constantine granted them jurisdiction in civil proceedings involving Christians with no appeal. The laity was gradually relegated to a supportive role as a strict hierarchical pyramid emerged, with the authority of the clergy becoming more and more dominant in all aspects of Christian life. The church was no longer the victim of secular justice, but the dispenser of it. And the clergy were the font of that powerful authority. Now, I'll bring this to a close, but I want to say one thing that's near and dear to my heart. With the Constantinian triumph, we see the ascendancy of hierarchical authority, male hierarchical authority, molded after the Roman imperial model. The Greco-Roman urban world, in the Greco-Roman urban world, women were valued members of culture and society. Inscriptions show that women were active in commerce and manufacturing, and like their male counterparts, used their money to gain recognition in the society of the cities. In Pompeii, a woman named Lumachia, who made her money in a brick-making company, paid for one of the major buildings of the city and donated it to the Workers' Association. Another woman built a temple, the genius of Augustus. Throughout Italy and the Greek-speaking world, a small but significant number of women are mentioned on coins and inscriptions as benefactors, city officials, and as recipients of municipal honors. Like men, women had their own clubs, or collegia. Women went to court, transacted business, and owned property, quite independently from their husbands. They were also very active in religious matters. Within cults, they were exclusively run by women, with state and municipal cults, and within cults that involved both sexes. Within the early church, even given the standards of the day, the role of women was especially powerful. In the New Testament writings, we see that the first hints that the Christian mission would be extended outside of Judaism came in two conversations between Jesus and women, the Samaritan woman and the Syrophoenician woman. Women are, of course, the first witnesses to the resurrection. After the resurrection, the apostles appear to flee to Galilee in confusion and fear, and return to Jerusalem only after they regain their composure. The women remained in the city. The Hellenists in Jerusalem met in the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, a woman of some means, for the house belonged to her and not her sons, and she had servants. Hellenistic Jews were accustomed to having women in the synagogues participating in festive meals. Certain images in the catacombs have been interpreted as depicting women presiding at a meal, which many feel is the Eucharist. Paul numbered women among his co-workers, and at Rome, a large number of women are important enough to be mentioned by name in the last chapter of Paul's letter to that community. Among them, Phoebe is described as a deacon. Houses were locations where women exercised a considerable degree of power and influence. And the house churches probably were the scene of such influence. Since baptism had replaced circumcision as initiation into the faith, there was established a new discipleship of equals, which is echoed in the writings of Paul. Gradually, however, as the church becomes more and more dominated by the institutional role of the bishop, a role of public authority relegated to men, the role of women became restricted, and with it, I would argue, an appreciation of the feminine. The Constantinian triumph marked the complete dominance of this public role of male authority, and the denigration of the feminine can clearly be seen in the art which was produced to adorn these new institutional churches. The house church was an environment conducive to the presence of females and the feminine. The basilica was an environment which was designed to produce awe and fear through images of male dominance. That's all I got. I kicked too long.